is then, if you will, mediated into speech, into something shared with other people. I've got two titles running for this book at the moment, and both of these titles are hijacked wonders, i.e. they are phrases stolen from other people. And I'll start by saying a little bit about them. One of those phrases is the suffering of images, and the other phrase is the illuminated theatre. And I've got various versions of a title of this project which includes both those phrases. The phrase the suffering of images is stolen from a theatre maker that I did some work with some other colleagues in the earlier part of this century, which is the Italian theatre maker Romeo Castellucci. I can't even remember the source of this phrase, but at one point this phrase, the suffering of images, came up. And it stayed with me. It stayed with me, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, it's an inversion of a phrase that one comes across quite a lot, even going back to, I don't know, Susan Sontag's famous work on photography and images, where one thinks about images of suffering. And I'm not really concerned with that. I like this inversion of the suffering of images. And I asked myself what that could possibly mean. Very simply, I think about a figure who comes into the space of a stage, a theatrical figure, an actor, if you want, who in some ways has to put up with the fact of being recognized, encountered as an image, as if the image is a certain sort of burden that the performer brings into the space of performance. I also think of the suffering of images as a thing which spectators, theatre thinkers, do. There's that phrase from the New Testament in an English translation where Jesus says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Suffering in that sort of sense, allowing to be in the company of, to be in the presence of what one might think of images, and what sort of obligations that puts on us. So the suffering of images. The phrase illuminated theatre, I am no philosopher, but this is nicked from a famous philosopher who I find very hard to read, which is the early 20th century phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, who is actually a very daunting philosopher. And there's a book he has about, he's called The Internal Consciousness of Time. And he's meditating away there on memory, on time, and how certain recoveries of memory, things that have happened before, whether they are actually being experienced over again or not. And he has very, very complex things to say about this. But at one point, an example appears in his rather abstract text, where he talks about going to the theatre in Berlin, and he says, the illuminated theatre that I experienced yesterday comes to mind again. It comes to mind as a memory. In all sorts of ways, that phrase has stuck with me. I'm interested in the theatre that comes to mind, or the theatre that we remember, or the theatre that we might have experienced and we want to share with other people. Why it might be illuminated, for a start. And I don't know whether Husserl is talking about a lit stage where he was an audience member, he doesn't say. Whether he's talking about being on a street in Berlin and actually the theatre is lit up from the outside, literally illuminated in that sense. What it is that's illuminated. But I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious that when he talks about the illuminated theatre comes to mind, it's a theatre which is absolutely unpopulated. This phrase, the illuminated theatre, keeps coming back again, but it's a theatre in which nothing seems to be going on at all, apart from the fact that the theatre is coming to mind. So, suffering of images and the illuminated theatre. I've got those things running around, and I thought, okay, how can I think about this today with a bunch of people who haven't been in my head for the last few years? And what I offer is a couple of examples, if you will. Examples of theatres which are not theatres. I'm going to talk about a video project, and I'm going to talk about prehistoric cave painting, briefly. What I take from these examples, I would say this as well, it's sort of a methodological issue, if you will, that I think of these things as frameworks for thinking. So rather than thinking that what I want to do is do a certain sort of analytical work or critical work on performance or theatres, works as such, but is to borrow from certain performances, hijack from certain performances, actual vehicles of thought. The way, if you will, the image making itself is a way of thinking. And if I can borrow that and work with it. So, you might know, some people here will know one or either of these examples. First one is a video project, which I'll tell you about. It's, I think it's from, it went over a long period of time. It's as an Italian group, who some of us here know well, called Kelleher, who made a video project called West. And it was a project made over many, many years. And basically what they would do is they would go to a capital city, and they would shoot each episode is like there'll be an episode for Athens, an episode for London, for Berlin, for Paris, what have you. And each episode is made up of very short segments which all have the identical same format. They're like postcards. There is a still camera pointing at a scene in that city, absolutely still. And it'll often be a sort of touristy scene. It'll be a recognizable view in that city. And there'll be a member of the public who's either been kind of got to do this in advance, or somebody picked up off on the street, who will be standing there in the frame, right in the center of the frame. And then what they'll do at a certain point is they will fall over. They collapse on the floor, like they're dead. The camera keeps shooting, and at a certain point, it stops. Cut. We're in another place in the same city. Some other strangers, standing there, staring directly into the camera, collapsing again. And this goes on and on and on and on. It's called West, like a series of postcards. Okay, some things about this I like. I'll offer a few things. One, we are in the contemporary world, and we're in the outdoors, and we're in the light where literally there's a natural light. Everything is outdoors. The light is given by whatever light happens to be there. We have people falling over, a sort of basic imitation of mortality. Here I am, there I go. And what happens is the camera keeps looking, and the world goes on doing what the world does. And I'd say two things about this first work. One word I would take is contingency. Think of contingency, a really simple meaning of what that word means. Contingency is what happens to us, what happens to happen to us. And contingency is what happens anyway, irrespective of us, what goes about its own business. So you'll see in these little clips, for example, somebody falls over, but meanwhile the traffic continues. Other passers-by will continue to pass by. A bird will land. A dog will come and sit next to the prone body. Anything can happen. The world just kind of goes on about its business. Contingency. The second thing, which interests me about this video work, of two things, is you're looking at somebody in the video frame, standing there, staring at you. They fall over. The camera keeps rolling. And I then, as they're lying down on the ground, wonder what it is that person might be thinking and feeling. And I don't know what it is. It's like there's some other time, some other sort of unit or quantity of time, which is contained in the experience of that person who's responsible for the image, which is inaccessible to me as a spectator. I have no idea what is going on for them. They are there in the image, having performed their action. Something else is going on, and it will never be going on for me. Boom. Example one. Two examples I said I'd offer you. They're both examples, I would say, of image-making gestures. They're examples of a certain act, of a certain performer, not a theatrical performer, not a professional actor, not a professional performer, responsible for the image, in the image. This is the second one, and this is a fantasy constructed by a French philosopher called Marie-José Monzin, who is somebody who's going to be working with me and Alan in February in London. So we've been rereading her work recently. And she's really a scholar of Byzantine theology. I won't go into that. But she has a book called Homo Spectator, the human as spectator. And she's interested in the sort of historical emergence of spectatorship as such. And she builds this fantasy upon a 32,000-year-old image. There's these caves in France, a place called Chauvet, and you've got